This is a heartwarming story about love, sacrifice, and the power of a promise. Charles, an 80-year-old man, is determined to fulfill the last wish of his wife Evelyn, who is in the terminal phase of an illness, to drive through a field of flowers in a convertible, feeling the wind in her hair and the sense of freedom. On a journey filled with challenges, Charles faces prejudice and difficulties, but also finds unexpected support in Mike, a young salesman who becomes his friend. As the story unfolds, the deep love between Charles and Evelyn is revealed, leading us to reflect on life, mourning, and the legacy we leave for those we love. A narrative that warms the heart and leaves a lasting mark. Charles stood at the hospital room door, watching Evelyn sleep. The silence was only broken by the soft hum of the oxygen machine beside the bed. The smile she wore while dreaming was faint, but it carried the same joy he had known since the day they met, over 50 years ago. Charles, the wind in the hair, the field of flowers. Evelyn whispered in her sleep. His heart tightened. It was that dream again, the wish she always mentioned in recent months. He had promised himself that somehow, he would fulfill this dream. The next day, with that promise etched in his heart, Charles put on his oldest jacket and headed to the nearest dealership. The first store he entered was modern, filled with shiny models and impeccably dressed salesmen. He walked around the showroom, eyeing the cars, but noticed something odd. Each time he approached a salesman, it seemed they looked away. The indifference was palpable. Finally, a younger salesman approached, but his demeanor was not welcoming. "Can I help you, sir?" "Looking for something specific?" he said, without even looking Charles in the eyes, making him feel invisible for a moment. "I'm looking for a convertible, for my wife," Charles replied, his voice laden with determination. He kept his head high, even feeling the discomfort of the environment. The salesman gave him a quick look, assessing his simple appearance. "Convertibles are expensive cars, you know? We have some used models, if that's what you're looking for." The tone was condescending, as if he was doing Charles a favor. "I'm not interested in used. I want the best you have." "She deserves the best," Charles responded firmly, trying to stay calm. But he knew what was happening. The salesman didn't believe he could afford it. Charles continued to walk through the showroom, his tired eyes scanning the shiny luxury cars. With each step, he felt the suspicious glances of the salesman, as if his mere presence there was a nuisance. He stopped in front of a beautiful red convertible, his heart racing at the thought of Evelyn smiling in that car. But before he could touch the bodywork, the same young salesman approached, his stance stiff and his tone impersonal. "This model is quite expensive, sir. Maybe we can find something more within your price range," the salesman said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Charles felt his blood rise to his face but breathed deeply, fighting to stay calm. He knew he was being judged, but he wouldn't let that stop him from achieving his goal. "I said I want the best," he repeated, trying to keep his voice firm. The salesman sighed and crossed his arms, clearly impatient. "Look, sir, I don't want to waste your time. We have some more affordable models over there in the used section. Maybe something there will fit better with what you're looking for." Charles felt a knot form in his throat. The humiliation was palpable, but he had no choice but to swallow his pride. "I'm not looking for used. My wife deserves the best, and I'm going to get that for her, whether you believe it or not." The salesman gave a slight ironic smile, as if pleased to have made Charles step out of his comfort zone. "Sure, sir. If you change your mind, I'll be around." Charles turned to leave when a different voice cut through the air. "Can I help you?" Mike, another salesman, approached, his expression showing genuine interest. Charles, feeling defeated by the treatment he had received, barely had the strength to reply. "I'm just trying to find a car for my wife. A last gift." But it seems I'm not taken seriously around here. Mike frowned, noticing Charles's discomfort. I see. I'm sorry about that. But let me show you some models. I think I can help you find something special. Charles hesitated for a moment, but something in Mike's tone made him continue. He followed the salesman to a more secluded area, where higher-value cars were displayed. As they walked, Charles felt the need to open up, to unload all the weight he had been carrying for the last few months. My wife, Evelyn, she's sick. She's always had the dream of riding in a convertible, feeling the wind on her face. It was a silly thing we always talked about doing one day, you know? But now time is running out. He stopped, his voice faltering for a moment. I've never been a man of great wealth. I've always lived a simple life, but I always promised her that one day I would take her for that ride. And now, I need to make it happen. No matter the cost. Mike was silent for a moment, absorbing Charles's words. He could see the pain in the man's eyes, and also the immense determination. You're doing something beautiful, sir, he finally said. And I promise I'll help you fulfill this dream. Charles looked at Mike, surprised by the genuine kindness. He was used to being treated with disdain, especially in that last week, as he tried to organize everything. Mike's words were a balm he didn't know he needed. I've saved every penny I could, Charles said, his voice now steadier. Every saving, every sacrifice, was thinking of her. I can't do much for her anymore, but I can give her this last wish. And that's all that matters to me. Mike nodded, clearly touched by Charles's sincerity. I understand. Let's make this happen. I have a car that I think will be perfect for you. They walked to a beautiful classic convertible, with smooth lines and a flawless finish. Charles stopped for a moment, almost speechless. It was exactly as he had imagined for Evelyn. He could see her there, with her hair blowing in the wind, smiling as she did on the happy days of their youth. This is it, Charles whispered, without any doubt. This is the car. Mike smiled. I knew you would like it. Let's get everything organized. And, if you need anything, I'm here. Charles went to the counter to make the payment. The salesman who had treated him with contempt watched from a distance, shocked to see him pull out a significant amount of money. Charles paid no mind. He had gone through too much to let someone's attitude affect him. With the keys to the convertible in hand, he looked at Mike, a smile of gratitude and determination on his face. Thank you, truly. I don't know if you realize how much this means to us. I think I do, Mike replied with a smile. And I'm glad to have been a part of it. As Charles prepared to leave, the promise he had made to Evelyn echoed in his mind. Nothing, absolutely nothing, would stop him from fulfilling his wife's last dream. He was ready to give her the moment of freedom she had always dreamed of, the wind in her hair, the scent of flowers, and that smile he so loved. Charles came home that night with the convertible parked in the garage. The car, with its flawless shine, stood in stark contrast to the simplicity of the small house he and Evelyn called home. Sitting on the couch, he gazed out the window at the vehicle, his heart filled with a mix of relief and anxiety. At the hospital, Evelyn was growing weaker by the day, but Charles knew that this small victory, the car, would bring her a bit of happiness. He longed to see her smile again, to feel the wind in her hair, the freedom she had always dreamed of. The next morning, under a clear sky and with a gentle breeze, Charles prepared everything to pick up Evelyn. He arrived at the hospital a little later than usual, carrying a single red rose that he had picked from their garden. The smile on her face when he entered the room was small, but genuine. You look handsome today, she said, her voice weak but full of love. Charles sat by her bedside, taking Evelyn's hand in his. I have a surprise for you, dear. Do you remember our old dream? Riding in a convertible, feeling the wind and flowers around us? Evelyn's eyes sparkled for a brief moment, as if a distant memory had been stirred. The car, she whispered, almost in disbelief. He nodded, smiling like someone holding on to a precious secret. Yes. It's out there, waiting for you. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Charles, you did this for me? I would do anything for you, Evelyn, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. I promised you, and nothing in this world would stop me from keeping that promise. They shared a quiet moment, the depth of their love, which had endured time, now facing its final test. Charles felt the weight of time pressing on him, but he knew that every second was precious, and he couldn't let this moment of connection slip away. Soon after, with the help of a nurse, Evelyn was gently placed in the car. Charles drove slowly, the road ahead lined with trees and fields just beginning to bloom. Evelyn, leaning back in the seat beside him, breathed in the fresh air with a faint smile on her lips, and Charles knew that this moment, however brief, was the pinnacle of the promise he had made. The wind stirred Evelyn's hair as if caressing her soul, and the fields of flowers in the distance completed the perfect scene they had both imagined. Charles held her hand, her fingers intertwined with his, as he drove through the countryside, feeling a sense of peace fill the car. This is our dream, Charles, Evelyn said, her voice as soft as the wind. Thank you for giving me this, for loving me so much. He couldn't respond immediately, a lump forming in his throat. I've always loved you, Evelyn. From the moment I first saw you. They continued the drive in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, where words were unnecessary. The bond between them, forged over decades, spoke louder than any words could. And by the end of that afternoon, under the setting sun, Charles knew he had fulfilled his promise, the greatest and final gift he could give. The drive back home was long, but Charles was in no hurry. Every minute with Evelyn felt too precious to rush. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The wildflowers, which they had dreamed of, swayed gently in the breeze, lining the road that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Evelyn closed her eyes from time to time, feeling the wind caress her face. For Charles, seeing that peaceful smile on her face was all he needed. He knew he was fulfilling his mission, giving her the freedom she had always dreamed of, even if just for a few hours. They continued driving through quiet fields, with no particular destination, simply savoring the moment. Charles spoke of old memories, stories they had lived together, and Evelyn chuckled softly, her voice growing weaker but still full of love. Do you think there's something after this, Charles? She suddenly asked, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes still closed. He looked at her, his heart tightening. I think so. I think what we have here, it never really ends. Love is forever. Evelyn smiled, that calm smile that always melted his heart. Then I hope we meet again. Somewhere, beneath these flowers. Charles swallowed hard, fighting back tears. We will, Evelyn. I promise. We'll be together, always. His words hung in the air as the sun disappeared over the horizon. Charles stopped the car at the top of a hill, offering a wide view of the fields of flowers below. The wind blew gently, and the silence of nature seemed to wrap them in a comforting embrace. It's beautiful, isn't it? He said, holding Evelyn's hand tightly. She didn't answer, but her peaceful smile remained, her face relaxed, eyes closed. Charles looked at her, his heart pounding, and at that moment, he knew their time together had come to an end. He stayed there for several minutes, holding her hand, letting the tears fall freely. The wind kept blowing, and he knew that, in some way, Evelyn was at peace. Her last wish had been granted. Charles spent the whole night beside her, in no rush to leave that place. He knew that when he returned home, things would never be the same again, but that moment was eternal. The next day, Charles returned to the city, driving the convertible for the last time with Evelyn by his side. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what he already knew, and the official farewell took place quietly, among friends and family. But for Charles, the real goodbye had already been given in that field of flowers. Mike, the salesman who had helped Charles buy the car, heard the news and came to visit the old man. When he arrived at Charles's small house, he found him sitting on the porch, his gaze lost on the horizon. "I'm sorry for your loss, sir," Mike said, sitting down next to him. "But I wanted to say it was an honor to help you make that dream come true." Charles looked at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I owe it all to you, Mike. Without you, none of this would have been possible. I didn't have much time, and you gave me what I needed most." Mike sat in silence for a moment, taking in the weight of those words. He looked over at the convertible parked in the yard, still gleaming under the sunlight, and understood the true value of that car. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of love, dedication, and promises kept. "I didn't do anything special," Mike finally said. "You did it all. And I just hope that, when I'm your age, I'll have lived a life as full of love as yours." Charles smiled, a tired smile, but full of peace. "Love is all we have in the end, my friend. And I was lucky enough to love and be loved by the best person in the world." The house was quieter than ever. Since Evelyn's passing, Charles found himself lost in the space that was once so full of life. The chair where she used to sit seemed like a constant reminder of her absence. He sat in his armchair, hands clasped in his lap, listening to the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. Time, which once felt like a gift, now crushed him with its slowness. It was strange how everything in the house seemed frozen, as if the world had stopped the moment Evelyn left. The photos on the walls, the little objects she had collected with such care, all seemed empty now. Charles knew he should move on, but how does one move forward without the person who had been their reason for living for so long? Some days passed in complete silence, while others were more bustling, with neighbors and family coming to offer their condolences, bringing cakes and coffee that he barely touched. He thanked them all, but deep down, nothing seemed to fill the void. It was on one of those lonely afternoons that Charles heard a soft knock at the door. He got up slowly, feeling the weight of his years in his bones, and opened the door to find Mike, the young salesman from the dealership, holding a package. "I brought something for you, Mr. Charles," Mike said with a friendly smile. "I was passing by and thought I'd check on you." Charles immediately felt a warmth seeing the familiar face. "Mike, it's good to see you, son. Please, come in." Mike stepped inside, taking in the cozy simplicity of the home. He sat in the chair Charles offered and placed the package on the table. "I wanted to thank you for letting me be part of something so special. That trip with your wife, it's something I'll never forget." Charles smiled, a small smile filled with memories. "It was the most important thing I could have done, Mike. And you played a big part in that. Without your respect, I don't know if I would have made it." Mike shook his head humbly. "It wasn't much, sir. I just wanted to do the right thing." They sat in silence for a moment, and Charles looked at the package on the table, curious. "What did you bring there?" Mike smiled shyly and pushed the package toward Charles. "I thought this might bring back some good memories." Charles carefully unwrapped the package, and inside, he found a fine wooden frame holding a photograph. It was a picture of the convertible Charles had bought, with him and Evelyn sitting together, smiling as the wind blew through their hair. Mike had taken the picture on the day Charles picked up the car, without him noticing. Charles's eyes filled with tears as he looked at the image. It was as if Evelyn were right there with him, in that moment, still alive, still smiling. I I didn't know you took this photo, Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. I took it that day, without you noticing, Mike replied. I thought it would be an important keepsake for you. Charles stayed silent, absorbing the kindness of the gesture. He gently ran his hand over the frame, feeling the cool wood beneath his fingers. You have no idea how much this means to me, Mike. Thank you, truly. Mike smiled, feeling satisfied that he had brought some comfort to Charles. I just wanted you to know that if you need anything, I'll be around. You don't have to go through this alone. After Mike left, Charles stood in front of the photograph for a long time. He ran his fingers across the glass, as if he could reach Evelyn through the image. That picture was more than just a snapshot of a moment, it was a tangible reminder of what had been his greatest act of love, his last great promise. In the days that followed, the photograph took a special place in the small living room. Charles positioned it on top of the fireplace, where he could see it whenever he wanted, like a window to a moment when Evelyn was still there, by his side. The simple act of looking at her smile in the picture brought a mixture of joy and sorrow, a reminder of what they had shared, but also of the pain of her absence. One afternoon, Charles sat in his backyard, watching the leaves fall from the trees. Autumn was beginning, and the air was colder, but he liked the silence of the season. It was a silence that made him think about everything he and Evelyn had lived through. They had always been humble, but it didn't matter, the love they had was what really mattered. As he reflected, his mind drifted back to the early years of their marriage. Evelyn had been a woman full of life, always with a smile on her face and a kind word for everyone around her. They had faced many challenges together, lack of money, illnesses, losses, but Evelyn always said that as long as they were together, they could overcome anything. And Charles had believed that with all his heart. Now, with her gone, he felt adrift, without direction. The emptiness was unbearable on some days, but on others, he could almost feel her presence, as if she were right beside him, whispering words of encouragement. And somehow, that gave him the strength to keep going. That same afternoon, while Charles was lost in these memories, he heard another soft knock on the door. When he opened it, there was Mike again, with that friendly smile. I hope I'm not bothering you, Mr. Charles. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. Charles smiled sincerely. You're never a bother, Mike. In fact, it's nice to have company. Come in, let's talk for a bit. Mike came in, and the two sat in the small living room. There was a comfortable silence between them, as if they were old friends. Mike glanced at the photo of Evelyn on the mantel and sighed softly. She seemed like an incredible woman. She was, Charles replied with a melancholic smile. Always full of life, always seeing the good in things, even when the world seemed to be falling apart around us. Mike leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, as if preparing to listen to a long story. It must have been hard, huh? I can't even imagine. Charles looked at the young salesman, and for the first time, felt that he needed to open up, to share something beyond the pain that had accompanied him every day. Life wasn't easy for us, but Evelyn always made it seem like everything was worth it. When we lost our first child, I thought she would fall apart. But instead, it was she who held me up, who kept everything together. She had a strength I never fully understood. Mike nodded, impressed. That's amazing. I've always admired stories like that, love that overcomes everything. Charles smiled, his eyes shining with memories. You know, Mike, when you love someone like that, truly love them, you do anything for that person. I would have given anything for Evelyn. And in the end, I gave all I could. The car, the trip, all of it was just a reflection of a lifetime of small sacrifices and promises kept. Mike nodded respectfully. He felt the depth of Charles's words and what they meant. You did what many wouldn't have the courage to do, sir. You kept your promise, even when it seemed impossible. Charles looked at him, grateful for that moment of understanding. That's true, son. Sometimes, love pushes us to do things we never thought we were capable of. But in the end, it's what keeps us alive. The love we give, and the love we get in return. They continued talking for a while longer, sharing stories and memories, until Mike finally stood up to leave. As he said goodbye, he looked at Charles with admiration. You're an inspiration, Mr. Charles. Really? If one day I have even half the courage you had, I'll consider myself lucky. Charles smiled, and for the first time since Evelyn's passing, he felt a lightness in his heart. Thank you, Mike. And remember one thing, true courage comes from the heart. That's something you'll find out one day. In the days following Mike's visit, Charles began to feel a little less alone. Although Evelyn's absence still weighed heavily on him, the conversation with the young salesman had sparked something inside him, a realization that even without her by his side, the love they had shared continued to live on in his memories. Charles's routine changed. He now spent more time in the backyard, tending to the small flowers that Evelyn had loved so much. It was a way to stay close to her, to keep nurturing something beautiful amidst the pain. Every flower that bloomed made him feel like Evelyn was smiling at him from somewhere. One day, while he was kneeling in the garden, Charles heard the familiar sound of a car engine. Standing up slowly, he saw the red convertible pull up in front of his house. It was Mike, once again, but this time he was accompanied by a young woman. Mike stepped out of the car, waving at Charles with his usual smile, and the young woman followed behind him, a bit shy. Charles walked over to them, wiping the dirt from his hands on his apron. Good morning, Mr. Charles. I hope I'm not bothering you again, Mike said, extending his hand. Charles smiled. Never, son. It's always good to see you. And who is this young lady? Mike placed a hand on the girl's shoulder, smiling proudly. This is my sister, Lisa. She really wanted to meet you. I told her about what you did for your wife, and she was deeply moved. Lisa smiled timidly and extended her hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. Your story touched me deeply. I just wanted to thank you for sharing something so beautiful. Charles shook her hand gently, surprised by the visit. I'm glad it touched your heart, Lisa. Evelyn, she was special. And it's good to know our story can inspire others. The three of them stood there, talking for a while, as Charles shared more about his life with Evelyn and how, even after her passing, he still felt her presence in every corner of the house and garden. She was always the stronger part of the two of us, Charles said, as he looked at the flowers in the yard. And now, these flowers, they remind me of who she was. Strong, but at the same time, delicate. Each one of them makes me think of a piece of her. Lisa and Mike listened in silence, absorbing Charles's words. His love for Evelyn was palpable, as if she were still there with them, between them. I hope I'm loved like that one day, Lisa said softly, her eyes full of admiration. I think that's what everyone wants, right? To be loved so deeply. Charles smiled, a smile that mixed joy and sadness. True love, my dear, is what makes life worth living. It doesn't matter what you have or what you achieve, in the end, it's love that defines us. And I was lucky enough to find that with Evelyn. Mike looked at Charles, thoughtful. Do you think we all can find that kind of love? Charles reflected for a moment before answering. I believe so. But true love, it's not just happiness. It's sacrifice, it's commitment, it's being able to put someone else before yourself, even when it seems impossible. The love Evelyn and I had wasn't always easy. But it was always true. Lisa nodded, touched by Charles's words. I hope I find something like that. Charles gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You will, Lisa. And when you do, remember to take good care of it. Because it's the most precious thing you'll ever have in life. The three continued talking as the sun slowly set on the horizon, casting a soft light over the flower garden. In that moment, Charles felt that the love he and Evelyn had shared hadn't just touched his life, but was beginning to touch the lives of others. Mike and Lisa were just the beginning, and in a way, Evelyn was still there, present in every word, in every flower, in every smile that Charles gave. In the following days, Mike and Lisa visited more often. Slowly, they became a part of Charles's life, bringing light and friendship to the old man who, despite his pain, began to rediscover the value of human connection. One cold winter morning, Charles woke up early, as usual, and looked out the window. The first snow of the year had fallen overnight, covering the yard in white, as if the whole world had been wrapped in a blanket of peace. He put on his coat and stepped out into the yard, the sound of the snow crunching beneath his feet. As he walked, he stopped in front of the flowers that Evelyn had loved so much. They were covered by the snow, but still stood firm, a silent reminder that even in the most difficult circumstances, beauty and strength could endure. Charles sighed, feeling the cold on his face, but also the comforting presence of Evelyn. I'm still here, my love, he whispered to the wind. Still taking care of our garden. And still loving you, every single day. With that, he turned to go back inside, his heart feeling lighter, knowing that as long as he was there, the love he and Evelyn had shared would continue to bloom. The winter when Charles lost Evelyn was one of the coldest he had ever experienced. The snow piled up in icy white mounds, and the biting winds made the windows of the small house creak at night. But despite the cold, Charles found a new strength within himself. Mike and Lisa visited regularly, bringing warmth and friendship to his lonely days. During one of those visits, as the snow fell outside, Charles decided to share something with Mike and Lisa that he had kept to himself for some time. They were sitting around the fireplace, sipping hot coffee, when Charles cleared his throat and looked at them with a gleam in his eyes. I've been thinking a lot about what comes next, he began, his voice low but steady. Lisa looked at him, curious. Next? What do you mean? Charles sighed, gazing at the crackling fire in the hearth. What comes after all of this? After losing someone like Evelyn. After fulfilling my greatest promise to her. I spent so much time loving and caring for her that, for a while, I thought there wouldn't be anything left for me when she was gone. Mike nodded slowly. I understand, Mr. Charles. It must be hard to imagine what to do now. Yes, it is hard. But, you know, after all this time, I think I've finally come to understand something. I've realized that the love I shared with Evelyn didn't end when she passed. It's still here. It lives on in me, in everything I do, and in every memory I hold. Lisa smiled, her eyes bright. That's beautiful, Charles. I thought that when I lost her, I'd be alone forever, he continued, his voice now softer. But I've realized I'm not. The two of you came into my life and showed me that there's still so much to live for. And for that, I'm grateful. Mike leaned back in his chair, smiling. I think we're the lucky ones, Mr. Charles. We've learned so much from you. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, just listening to the crackling of the fire. It was a comfortable silence, as if they all understood that sometimes words weren't necessary. But Charles knew he still had something important to share. There's one last thing I want to do, he said, breaking the silence. One final promise I need to keep before I close this chapter of my life. Lisa leaned forward, curious. What is it, Charles? Charles smiled at her, a serene smile, as if he was finally at peace with himself. I want to scatter Evelyn's ashes in the field of flowers where I took her that day. It was the place where she found peace, and I think that's where she would want to rest." Mike and Lisa remained silent, absorbing the depth of that declaration. They knew how much that field meant to both Charles and Evelyn. It was more than just a place, it was the symbol of their love, of a promise fulfilled, of the freedom Evelyn had finally experienced. "I want you both to come with me," Charles continued, his voice filled with emotion. "I want you to be there when I do this, because you're part of this journey now." Mike nodded, moved. "We'll be there, Mr. Charles." "It's an honor." The days that followed were a mix of preparation and reflection. Charles knew that the journey to the field of flowers would be the last great trip he would make. Winter was almost over, and he hoped that spring would bring back the flowers Evelyn loved so much. When the day finally arrived, Charles, Mike, and Lisa set off together in the convertible. The car glided along the quiet road as the sun shone in the blue sky, promising a beautiful day. Charles held a small urn in his hands, feeling the symbolic weight of the mission he was about to fulfill. When they arrived at the field of flowers, Charles stopped the car at the same spot where he and Evelyn had stopped months before. The wildflowers hadn't fully bloomed yet, but the promise of life was in the air, with small petals just beginning to emerge from the soil. With care and reverence, Charles stepped out of the car, followed by Mike and Lisa. He walked to the center of the field, where the wind blew softly, bringing with it memories of Evelyn. With each step, he felt he was completing the cycle of their life together. Finally, Charles stopped and looked up at the sky. "Evelyn, we're back," he whispered as he slowly opened the urn. "You always wanted to be here, and now you can stay." He gently scattered the ashes, allowing the wind to carry them away, spreading them across the field among the flowers Evelyn had loved so much. The scene was silent but filled with meaning. Charles felt a weight lift from his shoulders, as if he could finally breathe freely. As the ashes disappeared into the wind, Charles stood still, taking in the moment. Mike and Lisa approached him, saying nothing, just offering their silent support. Together, the three of them stood there, watching the field of flowers. "She's at peace now," Lisa said softly. Charles nodded. "Yes, she is. And so am I." The silence that followed was peaceful, not sad. Charles knew that while his journey with Evelyn had come to an end, the love they had shared would live on forever, in the flowers, in the wind, and in the people whose lives it touched. As they prepared to leave, Charles looked at Mike and Lisa with gratitude. "Thank you for being here with me. You've helped me more than you could ever know. And we'll always be here for you," Mike replied sincerely. Charles smiled. For the first time in a long time, he felt that the future, even without Evelyn by his side, could still be filled with new possibilities and memories yet to be made. As they drove back home, the wind gently blew through Charles's hair, and he closed his eyes, feeling Evelyn's presence once again. She was there, in the wind, in the flowers, and in the love they had shared. And that was another amazing story. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share. These steps are very important for the continuity of the channel. A big hug and see you soon.